So in India and Mesopotamia and Egypt and China, civilizations first developed along lush river valleys. And then as they continued to develop, some of them lasted a very long time. For example, Mesopotamia at this point in time, we're about 2000 BC right now, is continuing to thrive. They have a bunch of different city-states and empires that are taking over in Mesopotamia. Egypt is still going very strong. China is still going very strong, but we have had the decline and the disappearance of the Indus River Valley civilization. And so with these great civilizations that are in these areas, we now have, what about the people who are nomadic and are still in tribes that are just kind of traveling around doing the hunter-gatherer thing? They're starting to see, oh, settled life is great. We could build a city, we could have stable resources, stable source of food, increase our population. So enter the Indo Europeans. So the Indo Europeans came from the steppes, which are dry grasslands that are between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea above the Caucasus Mountains. And they were primarily pastoral people who herded cattle, sheep, and goats. They were a nomadic tribe. They also tamed horses and rode them into battle with light two-wheeled chariots. And one of the big things about the Indo-Europeans and why we really care quite a bit about them is that they are their language family that they brought in to the places that they migrated to is the root of a lot of the Romantic languages and a lot of the languages in pretty much half of the world, because almost all the languages in Europe can be traced back to the early Indo-European languages, as well as the languages of Persia and Turkey and India. And so, for example, we have the languages of English, mother, father, daughter, new, and six. They're just words, and you can kind of see as we go through Sanskrit, which is used in India, Persian, which is used in Turkey and the Middle East, as well as Spanish and German, which we are familiar with more because from Europe, that you can see that there is a similar phonetic structure, there's similar sounding as far as their beginning word sounds. And that's because they all came from the same language family of the Indo-Europeans. And we can tell where the Indo-Europeans settled because of their languages. So Slavic speakers would go towards the north and west. Celtic, Germanic, and Italic languages moved west through Europe. Greek and Persians went south, and the Aryans, who spoke early Sanskrit, went to India. Now, we don't really know why they moved from the steppes in all these different directions, but we are guessing that's because of some environmental factor that said they couldn't live there anymore, and they were seeking the stability of finding the more established civilizations in the river valleys. So one of the biggest group of Indo-European speakers, and one we might have heard of before, is the Hittites. They occupied Anatolia, which is also called Asia Minor, which you might recognize as being modern-day Turkey, which is a high and rocky plateau rich in timber and agriculture with nearby mountains that have mineral deposits. So they have lots of great natural resources, which is fueling their economy as well as their ability to make goods for war and build up their own cities. So the Hittite Empire was very successful. They're about settled in Anatolia in about 2000 BC. And they dominated Southwest Asia for about 450 years. They occupied Babylon and fought with Egypt for control of northern Syria. And the interesting thing about them in Egypt is that they actually were never able to kind of defeat Egypt. Egypt was never able to defeat the Hittites. So what they did is that they eventually signed a peace treaty saying, we will kind of share northern Syria, we'll keep the borders as they are, and we will work together to fight off any other invaders that might come in to try to take over one of us. So we've got two enemies kind of making peace because neither of them can actually win. And so the Hittites did a lot of things along with their conquering. So they're covering a very large piece of land, and what they did was they had their own Indo-European language that they used within the Hittite Empire with other Hittites, but then when they had to deal with internationals like international trade or Egypt, or when they went anywhere else for their conquering, they would use Akkadian, which is the language that the Babylonians spoke. And it was a little bit more widely used. So they had a language that they used for both within their own empire, as well as a separate language for when they were trading or trying to negotiate with other nations. And this is their capital. And you can kind of see that they have a very large city, sprawling, but they use walls very heavily because they are a conquering people, which means that they also were expecting to be conquered. They are very warlike people, and they had the technology to back it up. They excelled in the technology of war. One of the things that they used a lot was their kind of unique chariot, and so this would be the Egyptians over here, and this would be the Hittites over here. And so the Egyptians' chariot was similar. It also had two wheels. They pulled by a team of 2 to 4 horses, which was similar to the Hittites. They were both lightweight chariots. The difference between the Egyptian and the Hittite chariots is that the Egyptian had open panels on the sides because they were really going for speed and having to deal with going over large areas of the desert. And however, that did help them be very light and quick, but it did not help them with protection. And they mainly used swords and bows and arrows, where the Hittites used bows and arrows, swords, and spears, as you can see. They're also using, so they were able to kind of poke through the holes of their chariots and take out the legs of the riders of the chariots that they were fighting. And so with those spears, one of the things that the Hittites did first in this area, we talked about in presentations before that the Chinese were the ones that developed the cast iron system and being able to forge iron weapons and tools way over in Eastern Asia. But here in Western Asia and in the Eastern European area, the Hittites were the first ones to use iron in the Iron Age. And they used iron for their weapons, and iron was much stronger than bronze, and it was a huge impact in them being successful with their military conquests. And this was about 1500 BC was when they developed iron technology. Now, use of iron technology was, at first, it was unique for the Hittites, but then as they started trading with other peoples and conquering other peoples, obviously that knowledge of the process of how to make iron was going to spread and grow, and so the entire region started using iron tools and weapons if they had the resources to do it, which the Hittites did, because the Hittites, all they needed was iron ore, which they got from the mountains that were nearby their area, as well as charcoal, which you get from burning wood, and they had plenty of timber. And so the Hittites were able to have a surplus of iron and the ability to do that, whereas perhaps the rest of their conquered peoples or their opponents would not have as much, depending on the resources of the area. So the Hittites were very successful until they fell pretty suddenly about 1100 BC, and this was because there was a huge wave of invasions that came from the north and kind of wiped them out, which is pretty indicative of what happens to a militaristic people, is that you conquer people and then they come and conquer you. Kind of the European side. Now we're going to go to the part of the Indo Europeans who went towards more India and Eastern Asia. So these are the Aryans. So we talked about how the Indus River Valley civilization disappeared and nobody knows why. We think the biggest reason we think is that it was an environmental reason. There was a tectonic plate shift and there was natural disasters, and so that kind of killed them all off. The other thing is that we know that the Aryans came in kind of pretty soon right after from the north. They passed through the Hindu Kush Mountains Pass and kind of settled in to the Indus River Valley, right where the previous people had left. And the Aryans actually left almost no archaeological record. This is one of the very few actual pieces we have of archaeology from them. What we know most about the Aryans is from the Vedas, which is these documents on the right, which is their sacred literature. So it's basically their religious text. And it's a collection of prayers, magical spells, and instructions for performing rituals. And from these texts, which is they're written in Sanskrit, which is survived till today, because again, Indo European languages are the ancestral languages of our languages that we use today, we can read them. And because what we read, they have a lot of their cultural impact in them. And so the Aryans, we think of India, we kind of have heard of the caste system before, and the Aryans are the ones that kind of implemented that. And so how it first came up is that different people than the people that were nearby, because they weren't the only ones in India, there were other nomadic tribes. And so would be what an Aryan would look like. They were taller, they would have lighter skin, they spoke their own language. They hadn't actually when they first came in, they hadn't formed a written language. They just had oral tradition where they passed stories and rituals down from one generation to the next. And they had a pastoral lifestyle. And so this is what they look like. And then there was the people that were there as well that they were kind of competing against for territory, resources, and they were known as the Dasas. And they were shorter, had darker skin. They did have a written language. It was a separate language from the Aryans. And they lived in big walled cities. And so the Aryans and the Dasas had this big conflict. And the Aryans eventually kind of came out on top and then created a kind of social hierarchy of sorts. That's where it started. You can kind of see over here that this is their 4 beginning categories. And the first beginning categories, at first it was just based on what kind of job you had. You were a priest, you were a warrior, you were, trader or landowner, then you were, the peasants or doing the laboring. And it came from, being an occupational thing to being based on skin color and based on these are the people that were not originally here. These are not the part of the original Aryan tribe. And so they made these class distinctions much harsher and much had a whole bunch of different rules that went along with them. And so we went to Shudras, which is the very bottom one, which would be the feet of, this is the god Brahman. They were the laborers that did everything that nobody else wanted to do. And the distinctions started off being the occupational distinctions, then it turned into being based off of Varna, which means skin color or race. And then they actually called them Varnas. They were not called castes until 15th century AD when the Europeans came in actually, and they noticed, wow, you guys have super social classes that you do not mix. And so these were the 4 main ones that started off. They eventually grew to have hundreds of subdivisions, all based on who your family was, what exact job that you had, how much money you had, how religious you were, what religion you had, and all of these, and depending on what caste you belonged in, it determined your job. So you didn't really have a choice of what job you had. Who you could marry. You could marry for a caste lower than you and elevate that person, but you could not marry into a caste higher than you. And if you were marrying a caste lower than you, then that was not a great thing to do because you were marrying below your status. And you couldn't even eat with people of a different caste because that was how rigid the social structure was. Cleanliness and purity was a huge theme in their culture. And so anybody who they considered unclean, like butchers, grave diggers, or trash collectors, were actually not even included in the caste system. They were pushed below the Shudras, or below the laborers that did all the jobs that nobody wanted to. And they were considered untouchables, because if you even touched them or came in contact with them, you would be considered unclean. And it has a whole lot of religious significance about being clean and unclean. but based on what you did, there was all this stigma about it. And so the Aryans developed this part of the Indian culture. They then extended their settlements eastward. They had to go pretty slowly because the Indian jungle was not easy to clear. However, when iron came to India in about 1000 BC, it became much easier, and the Aryans started expanding their kingdom. At first, the leaders were chosen. Chiefs, when they were in small tribes, chiefs were elected by the entire tribe, and then you had, as people do, you have chiefs that get more of an influence over multiple tribes in a larger area. They want to control a bigger territory, so they start competing for bigger territories. And eventually, you get an empire. And so the Magadha Empire was the first major kingdom that started in India and then eventually grew and to encompass the majority of the Indian subcontinent. And so, yeah, that is where we get to for the Indo Europeans. The big thing that you guys need to remember, our main idea here, is that they migrated. So the Indo Europeans started in the steppes, they migrated into Europe, India, and Southwest Asia, and interacted with all the peoples living there. And because they're interacting with all these different peoples, they're sharing their traditions, their religion, their culture, their language with all those people. And so we have a lot of commonalities and we have a lot of sharing of ideas as people are moving around.